So you asked about food, which in a way you could think, what's more basic than that? In a way, there's nothing to talk about. Food's something you eat, you don't talk about it. And of course, we know that's not true, right? We know that the food section of newspapers is a section people really like to read. A lot of people read food criticism, or just think of the Food Network, which went from being a kind of niche channel to being this major empire that, even though it doesn't own all the shows, it in a way anticipated the popularity of food shows like we now see on Netflix. So I bet, if you're like me, your Netflix queue is going to have a lot of shows about food. And if you'd asked me 10 years ago, do you watch the Food Network? I'd have been no. But here I am watching a bunch of stuff about food. So, the first thing that's interesting about food is, on the one hand, we don't think about it at all, except when we're eating it. But we don't think about it as like an object of thought or of conversation. And on the other hand, if we look at our behavior, we're deeply interested in food, not just to consume it, but in a way to experience it in different forms. We're interested in the beautiful visuals, right, of some of the documentary series on Netflix, whether that present food the way that artists' work is normally presented. And we haven't seen that before, where you get this incredibly high quality, glossy, beautiful production. We're interested in food as art. We're interested in food as ideas. When the chefs are talking, and those are often the most mesmerizing parts of these documentaries or these shows, we're fascinated. It's amazing to hear what a chef at a 3-star Michelin restaurant or an experimental pop-up restaurant in New York or in Madrid, there's something just fascinating about listening to them talk. And you could say, well, part of that's just the fascination we take in any expert talking about what they care about. But I think it's more than that. Food is universal because we all have to consume it. We're all interested in it, even if we're not conscious of our interest, and even if the way our interest has developed varies across cultures and across time. So when we think about food, we have to start with the obvious facts that we don't consider. It's not just something we eat. It's something that in a way we're obsessed with as human beings. And when you begin with that obsession, you start to understand a basic fact of history that a lot of people may not know, but that as a scholar of religion is something I think a great deal about, which is food is at the center of all of the highest spiritual moments in traditional religion. So, right, we just went from food is maybe something that, of course, I eat, maybe I think about it, maybe I watch it on television, so it's like, aha, maybe it's entertaining, but totally different register here. But what I'm going to argue is that these registers are actually deeply connected. When you say, okay, what do you mean? Let's take the example most familiar in our cultural context, right? Which is, say, something like what Christians call the Eucharist, or some people call the Lord's Supper. But, this is a basic religious celebration that's at the heart of the Christian practice, in which there's bread and there's wine, and the bread is broken and there's prayer, and the wine is poured into cups, and people participate in this ritual. And for Christians, they think in some way that Christians don't all agree on, but in some way they're participating in actually communing with the body and blood of Jesus, which sounds crazy. And indeed, in the early Roman Empire, people thought they were cannibals because this was a secret ritual and they just heard we're eating and drinking Jesus. So you could say, well, that's pretty weird. It is pretty weird. But think about something that's a little less weird, but is a similar idea and was probably the inspiration, right? Which is Shabbat Dinner. Right? If you're Jewish, or if you've been to a Jewish friend's house on a Sabbath evening on a Friday, you have this incredible celebration, and you have the Kiddush, you have the blessing of the blood, you have the blessing of the wine. So once again, the high point of this ceremony that defines the Jewish people is food and wine. And you could find similar practices with great differences, but you can find a similar emphasis at the center of religious cultic practice. You're always going to find food. You're going to find bread, you're going to find wine. And why are we so interested in it? Well, the first thing to say, and this is just a teaser, there's so much more to say about this, but just on this point, I just want to connect these two things. This religious impulse, I would argue, is why we're so obsessed with food today in our secular culture. You see, most of us today don't participate in any cultic practices. And by cultic, I just mean practices of worship, not cult in the negative sense. That's the word that we use, academics use, and it's a useful word. So worship practices or rituals. But we don't participate in them. By and large, in the late modern kind of Western context, a lot of people don't go to church, they don't go to synagogue, they might not go to mosques, they might not participate in their traditions and festivals. And many people have never done these. They're completely foreign to them. And so they might find this religious dimension kind of very strange. And indeed, many of us, even if we're religious, might find it strange when we think about it. Why are we eating Jesus' body? That sounds utterly bizarre. What's going on there? Well, the reason is that food is not an idea. Food is the actual, tangible experience of being sustained by our communion with reality. So we are, in a way we perpetually forget, earth. In the Hebrew Bible, Adam, his name means earth. And so in one wonderful translation by the literary scholar Robert Alter at Berkeley, he translates Adam in the beginning of Genesis as the earthling. Fascinating. The earthling. So what does it mean to be a creature of the earth? It means that we depend on the earth. How do we depend on the earth? We think of the obvious things, shelter, but the most primordial way we depend on the earth is the very being that we identify ourselves with, our body, only exists because it is perpetually being renewed by the literal fruit of earth. And so in every act of eating, regardless of how unreflective we are actually participating in the most basic form of material communion, which sustains our very life. And you don't have to start talking about metaphors to see how even in that literal description, we have a connection of something that in one sense just seems a cultural fad, and yet on the other hand, as I could tell you and other scholars could tell you, is part of the deepest heart of religious practice. And that's just a teaser to begin to think about what would food be like if we approached it with the same thoughtfulness we approach everything else we care about.